There are nights when silence becomes your only language, not because you have nothing to say, but because the weight of your pain has robbed your voice. You lie awake, not from restlessness, but from the ache of a betrayal you never spoke about. The world sees your smile and assumes you're fine, but only God knows how many tears soaked your pillow while the world slept. Only He understands how loud silence can become when it carries the echoes of wounds that were never acknowledged. You learned to stay quiet, not because it didn't hurt, but because you were trying to protect those who hurt you. You chose peace over revenge. You endured blame for things you never did. You carried burdens you didn't deserve. And yet you stayed silent, hoping they would change, hoping they would understand, hoping that maybe, just maybe, God would step in. But what they didn't know is that every silent night was a prayer. Every suppressed cry was heard. Every time you turned away to weep in secret, heaven took note. We live in a world that applauds noise, that equates volume with truth. But God is not impressed by performance. He is moved by pain, especially the kind that is endured with grace. There is a sacred power in restraint, in holding back when everything in you wants to retaliate. And it is in that quiet suffering that your faith was forged. God did not abandon you in your silence. He recorded every moment. He numbered every sleepless hour. He collected every unseen tear. They thought your silence was weakness, but God saw it as strength. They believed your lack of response meant indifference, but God knew it meant you were battling in spirit. They assumed you'd forgotten what they did, but God never did. He's the witness who needs no testimony, the judge who requires no evidence, the Father who defends without you having to lift a single word in your own defense. And what's most powerful, He doesn't just see who hurt you, He sees who you became despite it. You didn't allow your pain to make you bitter. You could have become like them, sharp, careless, heartless. But you didn't. You remained soft. And that's why the pain hit deeper. Because your love was pure, your loyalty was unwavering, your intentions were sincere, and yet those very qualities became the weapon they used against you. But here's the hidden truth. Those who hurt you did not go unseen, and your silence was not ignored. It was stored for a divine season of restoration. What kind of world lets the guilty rest while the innocent tremble alone at night? What kind of justice system allows abusers to thrive while the abused are forced into silence? These are the questions you asked in the dark, not out loud, but in your heart. And the answer has always been, God does not forget. Time may pass, faces may change, but the record of your pain remains in His hands, and when the time is right, He will speak on your behalf, loudly, clearly, unmistakably. You may not have gotten closure, but you will get justice. You may not have received an apology, but you will receive healing. You may not have had support from those you hoped would stand by you, but God has always stood with you. Even when you were on your knees, begging for understanding, even when you buried your story to protect their reputation, even when your heart broke because your silence was misinterpreted as guilt, He saw everything. Every night you chose not to respond to that hurtful message, He saw it. Every time you swallowed your pain to avoid conflict, He noted it. Every time you looked in the mirror, wondering if maybe you were the problem, He stood beside you. And now He is preparing something you can't yet see, something that doesn't just soothe your wounds, but elevates you beyond the reach of those who wounded you. You see, healing doesn't always come in the form of answers. Sometimes it comes in the form of elevation, of clarity, of removal, of divine favor that makes others uncomfortable because they know what they did and still can't understand how you're rising. They'll say it's luck, they'll say it's coincidence, but deep down they'll know that the very one you cried to in the dark is now shining his light on your path. There is no betrayal hidden deep enough to escape God's awareness, no pain quiet enough to go unheard, no scar invisible enough that he doesn't see it. You may have been silent, but heaven has been loud on your behalf. Angels have been dispatched, justice has been delayed, not denied, and those who thought they got away with it are about to encounter a truth they never prepared for. God defends the silent. Let them talk now. Let them continue to twist your story, manipulate your silence, and weaponize your kindness. Let them play the victim while you keep rising. You don't need to explain. You don't need to prove, because the same God who saw you breaking in private will raise you in public. And in time, the same people who ignored your pain will be forced to watch your healing. So, hold on. Don't rush the process. Don't doubt the silence. It's not empty. It's sacred. It's the place where God crafts the greatest comebacks, where your tears water the soil of a harvest you can't yet imagine. Stay faithful, stay kind, stay hidden in God's presence, because the next time they see you, it won't be the same version of you they tried to break. It will be the version God rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and no longer silent. There is a special kind of strength that is born from silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of dignity. You could have exposed them. You had the truth. You had the details. You had the receipts. But you chose instead to protect your own peace. You chose not to become what they were. And though the world may never know what it cost you to stay silent, God does. They expected you to lash out. They expected you to crumble, to retaliate, to become bitter and loud and angry. But you didn't. You walked through the fire without screaming. You endured storms that would have sunk others. You were pushed, ignored, blamed, misunderstood, but still, you remained. Still, you chose to believe that pain must not be passed on, that silence can be a shield as well as a sanctuary. And for that reason, your story is not one of defeat, it is one of sacred survival. You were not weak for holding your tongue, you were wise. You were not cowardly for avoiding confrontation, you were consecrated. You understood something deeper. That truth has a timing, and God is the one who determines when that truth will roar. Until then, you chose silence not as surrender, but as strategy, because you knew what they destroy with words, God restores with favor. What they try to bury, God resurrects in glory. They thought the lack of noise meant they won, but God uses silence as a stage. He prepares his miracles in the hush of darkness. He wraps his justice in timing so perfect, so divine that no human hand can interfere. And in the time you were quiet, God was not inactive. He was preparing the tables, the ones he promised to set before your enemies, not just for vengeance, but for revelation. So they would know it was never you they defeated, it was him they provoked. There is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. This is not just a proverb, it is a promise. The ones who tried to cover their cruelty with charm, their betrayal with smiles, their sins with silence, they cannot run from the eyes of God. He sees beyond performance, beyond manipulation, beyond image. He sees motive. And he has already begun to separate those who appeared righteous from those who actually were. You won't have to argue your innocence. God is making it undeniable. They will remember what they did, not just in passing regret, but in the stillness of their own sleepless nights when peace eludes them. when blessings seem to disappear, when the same silence you knew becomes their own haunting. Because what is done in darkness doesn't stay buried forever. Not when God has marked it for justice. He doesn't let pain rot. He turns it into purpose. He doesn't let cruelty go unanswered. He doesn't let cruelty go unanswered. He transforms it into correction. And while they mocked your silence, God magnified your strength. While they laughed, thinking they escaped consequence, heaven was already shifting. The seasons were already turning, and what they did not account for is that pain has a memory, and that memory is sacred to God. He stores it, like seeds in the soil of His justice, and just when the world thinks it's forgotten, He brings forth a harvest that vindicates those who suffered in secret. They did not win. You simply took the higher road, and that road, while steep, always leads to elevation. You were not left behind. You were set apart. God isolated you so He could heal you, away from the noise, away from the damage, away from the watchers who only wished to see you fall. In your quiet, God did His deepest work. He strengthened your spine, softened your heart, sharpened your vision, and readied your spirit. It is not easy to suffer in silence. It takes more courage to stay still in injustice than to explode in anger. But you knew something deep inside, that this battle wasn't yours to fight in the flesh. You handed it over. And because you handed it over, you now walk with a calm that cannot be explained, a strength that is not loud, but immovable. You are not the same, and they can feel it. They look at you now and sense something has shifted. The same voice you once silenced is beginning to rise, but not with bitterness, with authority, with power, with peace. The kind of peace that cannot be faked or forced. The kind of peace that comes only when God Himself intervenes. The kind of peace that makes your silence no longer feel like suppression, but security. The people who hurt you expected a version of you to rise that would justify their actions. They hoped you would lash out. They hoped you would lose control, because that would make their guilt easier to bear. But you refused. You didn't give them what they wanted, and now they must sit with the version of you that survived without stooping. The version of you that glows with the light of someone who walked through hell and refused to lose their soul. They will say they never meant it, that it wasn't that serious, that you're exaggerating. But God knows, and He will not allow them to rewrite the story. He will not allow the ones who harmed you to escape the truth of what they did. And no matter how much time passes, He will return the truth to center stage, not to shame you, but to set you free. Let them forget. Let them move on. Let them pretend. You don't need their memory. You have God's. And His memory is perfect. He does not overlook. He does not excuse. He does not dismiss the pain of His child. You may have stayed silent, but now it is His voice that echoes. And when God speaks, no one can deny what they once ignored. There were nights you laid in the dark, not trying to sleep, but trying to find the reason. You searched for the answer to the question that echoed relentlessly. Why would someone I loved so deeply hurt me so carelessly? And when no answer came, you blamed yourself. You started rewriting the story in your mind, editing out your goodness and inserting imaginary flaws just to make their actions feel less cruel. You turned your heart into a courtroom and sentenced yourself for crimes you never committed. And still, you remained silent. But God saw it. He saw how you chose to protect people who wouldn't have done the same for you. He saw how you bent your boundaries to keep the peace, how you apologized to end arguments, even when you weren't at fault. how you swallowed your pain just so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. And he did not judge you for being silent. He admired you for being strong, because only the strong endure storms without cursing the wind. They'll never understand the nights you spent talking to God instead of talking to them. The moments you could have exposed the truth but chose to kneel instead. The tears you let fall onto your pillow, never onto their shoulder. You didn't weep in front of them because they were the ones who made you cry, and still you gave grace. Still you offered understanding. Still you convinced yourself they didn't mean it, that maybe they were hurting too, that maybe if you stayed, things would change. But God knew. He knew they weren't changing. They were just getting more comfortable with your silence, and so he began the process of awakening, quietly, gently, through restlessness, through discomfort, through moments of divine clarity. He didn't shake you awake. He stirred you softly, and one day you looked around and realized you weren't where you belonged. You realized that silence had become your prison instead of your protection, and that was the moment you heard God whisper, "You've been quiet long enough." It takes courage to be silent, but it takes even more courage to speak again, to take your power back from the pain, to decide that your voice matters, not to those who abused it, but to the God who gave it. You were never created to suffer quietly forever. Silence has its season, but so does resurrection. And resurrection always begins with the breath, your voice. Your silence was not in vain. It served a holy purpose. It preserved your soul when speaking would have invited more wounds. It shielded your spirit from the arrows of reaction. It gave you space to observe what words could not explain. It taught you how to hear God clearly when the noise of the world became too loud. And now, that same silence will be the foundation of your rising. Because those who learn to sit quietly with God will always stand powerfully before men. You are not the broken one. You are not the weak one. You are not the one who failed. You are the one who endured. You are the one who held your peace while others lost their integrity. You are the one who was bruised in silence, but healed in secret. And soon, you will be the one who is rewarded in public. There will come a moment, perhaps not today, not tomorrow, but it is coming, when the same people who misunderstood you will witness your elevation. And they will know without a shadow of doubt that it was not their praise that lifted you, but God's presence. That it was not your silence that failed you, but your faith that saved you. They will see the glow of someone who was covered in darkness, but never abandoned by the light. The silence that once hid your suffering will now amplify your story, because when God chooses to speak on your behalf, He does so without error. He defends without needing permission. He restores without requiring permission from your past. He lifts without looking for approval. And when He moves, nothing and no one can stop the rising. So don't mourn the years you spent unheard. Don't regret the moments you didn't defend yourself. Don't waste energy trying to rewrite what was already witnessed by God Himself. Nothing has been lost. Nothing has been wasted. God is the author, and He has not missed a single page. The pain they never acknowledged is the very chapter He's turning into your power. And the silence you thought was emptiness is the very space where He's building your breakthrough. You are not waiting for justice. It's already on its way. You are not begging for recognition. It's already written. You are not fighting for peace. It's already yours. The same God who saw you in your lowest moment is now preparing a place for your highest one. And when He brings you there, you will not need to explain. Your peace will speak. Your joy will testify. and your silence will echo louder than any scream. They don't know what it cost you to carry the weight of their actions in silence. They don't see the cracks they left behind. They don't feel the loneliness that followed you into the night, or the silence that echoed louder than any noise. They look at you now and assume it was easy, that the way you smile means it never hurt, that your strength means you were never weak. But they weren't there when you fell apart behind closed doors. They didn't hear the conversations you had with God when the pain made no sense. They didn't see the nights your heart bled in secret while your voice remained quiet for their sake. But the truth is, you weren't silent because you didn't care. You were silent because you cared too much. You were silent because you loved them, because you valued peace more than pride, because you believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when they repeatedly gave you pain in return. And somewhere along the way, you started thinking your silence was a flaw, that maybe your quietness was weakness, that maybe if you had been louder, they would have listened. But that is not true. You were not weak for staying quiet. You were wise. You knew that not all battles are won through noise. God watched you give people chances they didn't deserve. He watched you extend kindness in return for cruelty. He watched you walk into rooms filled with tension and still try to bring peace. He watched you lower your voice to avoid raising someone else's anger. He watched you pretend you were fine just to keep everything from falling apart. And while they misunderstood you, while they took your silence for submission, God was writing your story, not the one they told about you, but the one He knew. There is a sacredness in silence, a holiness that only those who've suffered in secret can understand. It is the place where God speaks most clearly. It's the space where the world's noise fades and His whisper becomes thunder in your spirit. That's why your quiet moments weren't empty. They were filled with divine dialogue. That's why, even in your stillness, you were never alone. Heaven was listening, heaven was weeping with you, and heaven was preparing the next chapter. They were writing your ending with assumptions, but God was preparing your next beginning with truth. They thought your silence was the final word, but God's justice hasn't even spoken yet. And when it does, it won't sound like revenge. It will sound like restoration. It won't sound like anger. It will sound like favor. Because the most powerful response to betrayal isn't retaliation, and that is what's coming. Not just healing, but rebirth. You've walked through the wilderness of misunderstanding. You've tasted the bitterness of false accusation. You've endured the coldness of abandonment. And yet, your heart didn't turn to stone. You still pray for them. You still carry compassion, even for those who left scars. That is strength. That is holiness. That is why your story doesn't end with brokenness. It ends with glory. God doesn't need to prove your innocence to anyone. He just needs to show your growth. He doesn't need to expose their wrongs. He just needs to elevate your life. Because when you rise, the truth becomes visible without a single word spoken. When you shine, it exposes every shadow they tried to keep you in. You won't need to explain yourself. Your healing will say everything. There are people who watched you suffer and remained silent, people who knew the truth but kept quiet to protect their comfort, people who sat beside your pain and pretended not to see it, and still you didn't hate them. Still you showed grace. Still you loved with open hands. And God saw that too. He saw who stayed. He saw who walked away. He saw who chose silence when they should have spoken up. And He has kept the record, not to punish, but to preserve justice. Because when He blesses you, when He restores you, when He places you in rooms that your pain could never have imagined, you will know. You will know it was not man who lifted you. It was not chance. It was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was God. The same God who saw you crumpled in silence is the one who is now raising you without noise. They hurt you, and you protected them. They lied about you, and you stayed quiet. They watched you struggle and offered no hand, and still you rose. Still you forgave. Still you prayed, not because you were foolish, but because you were faithful. And now it is God who is moving, slowly, strategically, with the precision only heaven knows, not just to heal you, but to honor the silent battles you fought when no one else knew the war existed. There's something holy about the moments when you could have spoken but didn't, when you could have revealed everything, exposed the lies, named the pain, and yet you chose to carry it quietly, not because you didn't know how to speak, but because you knew your words held weight, and you refused to use them to injure. That kind of self-restraint is rare. It is not taught. It is forged. It is born in the hearts of those who've suffered deeply and still choose not to become the source of someone else's pain. People often confuse silence with surrender. They think you walked away because you had no power left. They believe you didn't argue because you didn't have a voice. They assume you disappeared because you were defeated. But silence is not always an absence. It is a sacred act of preservation. You didn't go silent because you were weak. You went silent because you were wise enough to know that not every battle deserves your voice. Some wounds are too deep to explain to people who never intended to understand. God sees the difference. He knows when silence is your sanctuary, not your prison. He knows when you've chosen the higher road, even when it costs you everything. He knows how many nights you've laid in bed, rewriting the past in your mind, wondering what would have happened if you had spoken up. He knows the ache of carrying a story no one else would believe. He knows what it's like to love people who left you in silence and then pretended they were the ones abandoned. And so, he began to work in the silence. He began to comfort in ways no human could, not through words, but through his presence, not through explanation, but through assurance. The kind of assurance that whispers to your spirit, I was there, I saw it all, and I'm not finished yet. Because God doesn't just heal what's broken, He transforms it. He doesn't just restore what was lost, He increases it. And He doesn't just rescue you from the fire, He refines you through it. What they meant to crush you became the foundation for your clarity. What they did to isolate you became the space where God revealed Himself more intimately. They saw your silence as disappearance, but you weren't disappearing. You were being hidden. Hidden by God, protected, preserved, set apart. While they were still playing with masks and roles and stories, God was writing something eternal within you. He was giving you a strength that wouldn't need defending, a peace that wouldn't require permission, and a future they couldn't steal. There's something powerful about the kind of healing that happens in silence. It's the healing that no one sees coming. It's the transformation that's born in hidden places, away from the eyes of those who underestimate you. It's when God becomes your counselor, your defender, your teacher, and your healer. It's when your identity is no longer attached to what they said or did, but to who God says you are. And when that shift happens, nothing can pull you back into the version of yourself they tried to keep you in. They wanted you broken so they wouldn't have to confront their guilt. They wanted you silent so they could feel powerful. They wanted you ashamed so they could remain proud. But now the silence is shifting. Now the silence is birthing strength. Now the silence is echoing truth. And that truth is this: you survived. Not just barely, but beautifully. Not just quietly, but intentionally. Not just alone, but divinely guided. You no longer need them to understand your pain. You no longer need them to admit what they did. You no longer wait for them to come back and make it right. Because now you understand. Your healing is not in their hands. It never was. Your justice is not in their apology. Your restoration is not in their regret. Your freedom is not in their change. It's in God. And He is not slow. He is strategic. He is faithful. And He is working. When the world sees what He's been building inside you, they will wonder how you did it without attention, without noise, without help. And they will have no choice but to admit it was never you alone. It was something greater. It was someone greater. It was the same God who sat with you in silence, who heard every unspoken word, who collected every tire, who watched every time you held your breath just to keep the peace, that God is now speaking, that God is now moving, and when He moves, everything changes. The beauty of your story is not just that you survived the pain, it's that you did it quietly. It's that while they celebrated their false victories, while they stood on your silence as if it were weakness, you were being rebuilt in secret. They thought they were winning because you didn't retaliate, but God wasn't interested in petty responses. He was interested in divine reversals. And what you didn't know then is that every time you held your tongue, you handed Him the pen. Every time you withheld revenge, you gave Him room to write a better ending. And now, the pages are turning, slowly, silently, but powerfully. The world won't hear thunder. There will be no announcement, but your life will begin to rise in ways that silence all doubt. Not because you forced it, but because heaven has already approved it. And what heaven approves, no one can deny. They tried to reduce you to their opinion of you. They measured your worth through the lens of their own limitations. They spoke confidently, even arrogantly, about who you were, what you did, what you meant. And in your silence you watched as they painted your image in the minds of others with lies and shadows. That was the hardest part, wasn't it? Not just the betrayal itself, but watching them shape a story you weren't allowed to correct, watching people believe it. Watching people pull away from you because of what they heard, not because of who you are. But even in that, you stayed silent, because you knew the one who holds the truth would never be deceived. God never needed your defense to recognize your character, and He never let go of the injustice. He simply stored it. Stored it for the right moment. Stored it until the silence became full enough to break wide open in glory. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove you were always right to trust Him. And that's what they never saw coming. That you were trusting someone greater. That while they manipulated and twisted and plotted and laughed, you were in communion with God. That your silence was not just emptiness, it was surrender. A holy surrender, a sacred stillness, the kind of stillness that only those in pain understand and only those in faith endure. There is a special kind of authority born in silence, the authority of someone who has nothing to prove but everything to become, the authority of someone who knows that their value is not dictated by vindication but by vision. And you, whether you knew it or not, were walking in that authority. You were being led, even in your pain, by a God who specializes in turning mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, silence into symphony. You see, silence doesn't last forever. There comes a time when the same God who allowed you to endure in quiet begins to speak through your rise, not as an act of vengeance, but as a revelation of who you truly are, of what you were truly made for, of the things you had to go through to become the person who can now carry purpose without bitterness, peace without fear, power without pride. You were never supposed to stay in hiding. That season had its time. But now you are being called out, not into chaos, but into clarity, not into noise, but into notice. Because there are people who need to see what resilience looks like. There are souls who need to witness what redemption really means. And your life, yes, the one they tried to destroy with gossip and lies, is becoming the very story that God will use to show others what healing looks like when it's written by heaven. They won't understand it. Some will resent it. Some will try to downplay it. But you won't need to defend it. You won't need to explain why God is favoring you now. You won't need to justify why doors are opening or how peace found its way back into your life. Because when God raises someone who stayed silent through pain, He does it in such a way that the transformation becomes undeniable. And so you walk forward now, not with anger, not with revenge, but with reverence, with the deep knowledge that the same God who saw the nights you stayed silent is the same God now writing your name in places your enemies can't reach. And this new chapter, this rise, is not built on proving anyone wrong. It's built on becoming who God always knew you were, even when others refused to see it. You were never meant to stay hidden forever. God didn't allow the silence to punish you. He allowed it to preserve you. The silence was not a prison, it was preparation. It was a sacred hush where heaven began to shape you into someone the world would one day have to notice. Not because you shouted, not because you demanded attention, but because the quiet power of God's favor will always be louder than the noise of false story. You didn't speak because your heart still loved them, because you couldn't bear the thought of destroying someone, even if they had no problem destroying you. And that's what makes you different. That's what makes you dangerous in the most beautiful way. You are the one who felt everything deeply, yet still walked with grace. The one who was wounded, yet didn't wound in return. The one who could have screamed but instead prayed, and those prayers, those whispered cries in the darkness, became the language of deliverance. Now God is answering those prayers, not in shouts, but in shifts. You'll begin to notice things falling away, not because you failed, but because you finally outgrew what once broke you. You'll begin to feel lighter, not because the pain was erased, but because it no longer has the power to define you. And one day, you'll wake up and realize you haven't thought about them in a long time, not because you've forgotten, but because you've been filled with something greater. The silence that once felt like suffocation now feels like peace. The space that once echoed with pain now breathes with purpose. You didn't need closure to move forward. You needed clarity. And God gave it, not in explanations, but in elevation, not in their confession, but in your becoming. The old version of you who waited for someone to make it right has been buried. In her place stands someone unshakable, not because she never broke, but because God put her back together in a way no man can undo. They'll look for the old you and not find her. They'll expect you to still be stuck in the pain they left you in. But what they didn't expect is that silence is fertile ground for transformation. And God was not idle during those nights. He was planting something that's now blooming in places they can't reach, in ways they can't control, and in timing they can't interrupt. You no longer owe them your voice. You don't owe them your story. You don't even owe them your pain, because the story now belongs to God, the author of justice, the keeper of memory, the defender of the unheard. He has turned your silence into a testimony, and he will speak through your life in ways no one can deny. You don't need to explain what they did. You don't need to prove how deeply it hurt. You don't need to justify why you stayed silent, because God is already making all things clear. The truth has a way of rising even without your help, and those who tried to bury it will one day be buried by it, buried not in shame, but in the weight of what they refused to carry when it was still light enough to hold. Let them talk, let them rewrite, let them forget. You're no longer bound by their noise. Your destiny isn't tied to their acceptance. You have outgrown their understanding, and in the stillness of your soul, you now carry something they cannot counterfeit: peace that passed through fire, joy that was born through mourning, strength that did not come cheaply. You stayed silent not because you had no story, but because you were waiting for the right time. And now, your life is the story, not one written in bitterness, but in breakthrough, not one narrated by pain, but by power, not one remembered by what they did, but by what God did with it. He saw it all, the long nights, the inner battles, the restraint, the silence, the strength. And now, he's responding in ways only heaven can, quiet, steady, undeniable. Because God sees the nights you've stayed silent about who hurt you, and he's about to make sure the world hears what that silence built.